What happens when royal privilege meets daytime television reality? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle sits down with the View's Powerhouse panel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. Last night's episode delivered the most explosive confrontation in the show's history, culminating in a dramatic walkout that has left viewers choosing sides and social media in absolute chaos. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when careful media training collides with unfiltered daytime television honesty. The studio atmosphere was already charged as cameras rolled on what producers had billed as an exclusive sit-down with the Duchess of Sussex. Meghan arrived impeccably dressed in a cream-colored blazer, her media-trained smile firmly in place as she settled into the guest chair across from the panel. The initial pleasantries felt rehearsed, almost mechanical, as Whoopi Goldberg welcomed her with the standard opening remarks about her latest philanthropic ventures and upcoming projects. But beneath the surface politeness, tension was already simmering. Joy Behar's body language suggested skepticism from the moment Meghan began speaking about her commitment to amplifying marginalized voices through her various media partnerships. The veteran comedian's eyebrows remained permanently raised, her pen tapping against her notepad in a rhythm that seemed to match her growing impatience with what she clearly viewed as carefully crafted talking points. "Let's talk about authenticity for a moment," Joy interjected, cutting through Meghan's prepared remarks about social justice initiatives. "You've spoken extensively about wanting privacy for your family, yet you've signed multi-million-dollar deals with streaming platforms, written tell-all books, and given explosive interviews. How do you reconcile that contradiction?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down. Meghan's practiced smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she recovered, her voice taking on a slightly defensive edge as she launched into an explanation about the difference between chosen privacy and intrusive media coverage. Her hands gestured more animatedly now, the careful composure beginning to crack under the unexpected directness of the questioning. Sunny Hostin jumped in with apparent support, attempting to steer the conversation toward the racial dynamics Meghan had previously discussed in other interviews. "The British tabloid treatment you received was undeniably harsh and often racially charged," Sunny offered, seemingly throwing Meghan a lifeline. "Can you speak to how that affected your mental health and your decision to step back from royal duties?" But instead of gratitude for the softer angle, Meghan's response carried an undertone of frustration that caught even Sunny off guard. "I appreciate the question, but I think it's important to understand that the narrative has been consistently misrepresented. The decision to step back wasn't reactive. It was a strategic choice to protect our family and pursue meaningful work outside the constraints of an institution that, frankly, wasn't equipped to support a modern, diverse monarchy." The word strategic seemed to land particularly hard with Sarah Haynes, who had been quietly observing the exchange. Her usually diplomatic demeanor shifted as she leaned forward, her voice carrying a new sharpness. Strategic is an interesting word choice, because from the outside, it looked like a series of very public grievances aired at increasingly high profile venues. The Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, Harry's book, that's a lot of strategy for people who wanted to step away from public life. Meghan's composure visibly tightened, her shoulders squared, and for the first time since sitting down, her media training seemed to be failing her. "I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what stepping away meant. We never said we wanted to disappear. We said we wanted to control our own narrative instead of having it controlled by an institution and a media ecosystem that had no interest in presenting us fairly. But controlling your narrative has meant consistently criticizing the very family and institution that gave you a global platform." Alyssa Farah Griffin interjected, her political background evident in the precision of her question. "At what point does sharing your truth become something else entirely?" The studio temperature seemed to rise several degrees. Meghan's carefully modulated voice began to show strain as she responded. "I find it fascinating that when I share documented experiences of racism, isolation, and institutional failure, it's characterized as criticism rather than accountability. Would you ask a survivor of workplace harassment why they're being so critical of their former employer?" The comparison sent a visible ripple through the panel. Joy's pen stopped tapping. Whoopi, who had been moderating with her usual even-handed approach, suddenly looked more alert. The carefully maintained balance of the interview was beginning to tip towards something much more volatile. "That's quite a comparison," Joy said slowly, her comedian's timing making each word land with deliberate. "Wait, workplace harassment is a serious allegation. Are you saying the royal family engaged in harassment?" Meghan's response came too quickly, too defensively. "I'm saying that institutions that fail to protect their members from racist attacks and then silence those members when they try to speak up are engaging in harmful behavior, whether they want to acknowledge it or not." The panel exchanged glances that spoke volumes. What had begun as a standard celebrity interview was rapidly transforming into something much more confrontational. Sunny attempted another diplomatic intervention, but the damage was already done. The careful choreography of daytime television was breaking down, replaced by the raw tension of a conversation that had veered far from anyone's prepared talking points. Alyssa pressed further, sensing an opening. But didn't the palace offer resources? Mental health support, media training, protection from negative coverage? It seems like there were attempts to help that maybe weren't fully utilized or appreciated. Meghan's laugh was sharp, almost bitter. "Resources? You mean the same institution that suggested I simply endure racist attacks in silence because responding would be undignified? The same people who refused to correct obvious lies about me, but had no problem immediately defending other family members when they were criticized." The word lies seemed to electrify the studio. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from diplomatic curiosity to something approaching incredulity. "That's a pretty serious accusation. Are you saying the royal family actively participated in spreading false information about you?" "I'm saying they had a very selective approach to truth-telling," Meghan replied, her voice rising slightly despite her apparent efforts to maintain control. "When stories benefited their preferred narrative, they were allowed to stand. When stories could have protected me and my family, suddenly there was no comment, no correction, no protection." The tension in the studio had become almost suffocating. What started as carefully managed media messaging was devolving into something rawer, more personal, and significantly more volatile. The hosts were no longer lobbing softball questions or offering supportive commentary. They were digging deeper, pushing harder, and Meghan's responses were becoming increasingly defensive and accusatory. Joy seized on the moment, her decades of experience in confrontational television taking over. "So let me understand this correctly. You're saying that one of the world's most prestigious institutions, with centuries of experience managing public relations crises, deliberately chose to hurt you rather than help you. That sounds less like incompetence and more like malice. Is that what you're alleging?" The question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and everyone in the studio could sense that whatever came next would determine whether this interview could be salvaged or whether it was about to explode into something unprecedented. Meghan's face had transformed completely. Gone was the carefully constructed media persona, replaced by something raw and unfiltered. Her voice, when it came, carried a tremor of barely contained emotion. "Malice? You want to talk about malice? Let's talk about how they allowed tabloids to publish stories about my father that they knew would devastate me, stories they could have stopped with a single phone call. Let's talk about how they stood by while commentators questioned my child's skin color on national television." The studio fell into stunned silence. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze as the weight of her words settled over the room. Whoopi, veteran of countless confrontational moments, looked genuinely taken aback by the raw intensity of Meghan's response. "Hold on," Sarah interjected, her voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. "Are you seriously suggesting that the royal family orchestrated negative media coverage about your own father? That they somehow controlled what tabloids chose to publish about Thomas Markle's situation?" Meghan's laugh was harsh, almost desperate. "Control? They didn't need to control anything. They just needed to stay silent when it mattered and speak up when it served them. When Harry's friends leaked stories about our relationship being serious, suddenly the palace had plenty to say. When my father was being manipulated by photographers and falling apart publicly, silence. Complete radio silence." Alyssa leaned forward aggressively, her political instincts clearly activated. "But Thomas Markle made his own choices, didn't he? The staged photographs, the interviews he gave after your wedding, The ongoing public statements. How is any of that the royal family's responsibility? The question struck like lightning. Meghan's composure, already fragile, began to crack in real time. My father was being stalked by photographers, offered money he desperately needed, and manipulated by people who knew exactly how to exploit his vulnerabilities. A single statement from the palace could have shut that down. They had that power. They chose not to use it. Or maybe, Joy said, her comedian's timing now weaponized. They recognize that your father is a grown man capable of making his own decisions. And they weren't about to start controlling the media for every family member's personal drama. The word drama seemed to detonate something inside Meghan. Her carefully maintained posture collapsed as she leaned forward, her voice rising to a level that made the sound technicians scramble to adjust their equipment. Personal drama? My father's mental health crisis was personal drama? The racist attacks on my unborn child were personal drama? The death threats that forced us to change. Our security protocols were personal drama. Sunny attempted to de-escalate, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern. Meghan, I think what Joy meant. No, Meghan cut her off sharply. I know exactly what she meant. It's the same dismissive attitude we've faced from day one. Everything that happened to us gets minimized as drama, as attention-seeking, as somehow our own fault. But when William and Catherine face criticism, suddenly the full force of the institution swings into action. The comparison hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah's expression hardened noticeably. Are you suggesting that Catherine receives preferential treatment because of her race? I'm suggesting that Catherine receives the support that was denied to me, Meghan replied, her voice now steady but carrying an undertone of steel. When she was criticized for her work ethic in the early years, palace sources immediately pushed back with stories about her charitable work and family commitments. When I was attacked for identical behavior, the response was that the Duchess of Sussex should simply ignore the criticism and carry on. Joy's pen had stopped moving entirely. Her expression suggested she was done with diplomatic approaches. Maybe the difference is that Catherine didn't spend her first year in the family giving explosive television interviews about how difficult everyone was making her life. The comment landed like a physical blow. Meghan's face flushed, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely speechless. When she found her voice again, it carried a dangerous edge. The Oprah interview happened after we had already left, after we had already been subjected to 2 years of systematic undermining. It wasn't our first response, it was our last resort. But it was quite a resort, Alyssa observed coolly. Global television audience, carefully timed revelations, maximum impact during a pandemic when the Queen was isolated and vulnerable. That doesn't feel like a last resort. It feels like strategic warfare. The phrase strategic warfare seemed to flip a switch. Meghan stood up slightly in her chair, her body language shifting into something approaching confrontation mode. Strategic warfare? We told our truth about our experiences. If that felt like warfare to them, maybe they should examine why the truth felt so threatening. Whoopi finally stepped in, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had moderated thousands of heated exchanges. Let's take a step back here. We're talking about some very serious allegations, are we? Meghan interrupted, turning toward Whoopi with an intensity that caught the veteran host off guard. Because it seems like every time I try to address what actually happened, it gets reframed as drama or strategy or attention-seeking. At what point do we acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the institution failed us? The studio had become a pressure cooker. Sarah seemed to be calculating her next move carefully. Failed you how specifically? Because from the outside, it looks like you were given a fairy tale wedding, a global platform, incredible resources, and the support of millions of people. What more could any institution have done? Meghan's response came in a rush, her careful media training completely abandoned. They could have corrected the lies. They could have protected my family from racist attacks. They could have treated me like a human being instead of a problem to be managed. They could have acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, their centuries-old system needed to evolve to accommodate someone who didn't fit their traditional mold. Or, Joy said with devastating calm, maybe you could have acknowledged that joining a 1,000-year-old institution might require some personal adaptation, rather than expecting the entire system to change for you. The comment hit like a slap. Meghan's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, anger, before settling into something harder and more determined. Personal adaptation. Is that what you call accepting racist abuse in silence? Is that what you call watching your mental health deteriorate while the people supposed to protect you stand by and do nothing? The mention of mental health seemed to shift the room's energy slightly. Sunny leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine concern. The mental health struggles you've discussed are obviously serious. But couldn't those resources have been accessed privately, without the public confrontation with the institution? Meghan's laugh was bitter. Private resources? You mean the same private resources that came with the caveat that I should never discuss what I was experiencing publicly? The same private help that required me to pretend everything was fine while I was struggling to survive each day. The raw pain in her voice was undeniable, but it seemed to have the opposite effect on the panel than she might have hoped. Instead of sympathy, it seemed to generate more skepticism, more probing questions, more challenges to her narrative. Alyssa, press the advantage. But millions of people struggle with mental health issues without airing their family's private business on international television. What made your situation so unique that it required that level of public disclosure? The question seemed to break something inside Meghan. Her carefully maintained boundary between public and private persona collapsed entirely as she turned toward the panel with undisguised frustration. Because private solutions weren't working. Because the same institution that was supposed to protect me was actively undermining me. Because sometimes the only way to stop institutional abuse is to make it public. The word abuse seemed to electrify the studio once again. Joy's eyebrows shot up. Abuse is a very strong word. Are you alleging that you were abused by the royal family? Meghan's response was immediate and passionate. I'm alleging that systematic isolation, deliberate undermining, and willful indifference to racist attacks constitutes a form of institutional abuse. Yes. When you have the power to stop something harmful and you choose not to exercise that power, you become complicit in the harm. The panel exchanged looks that suggested they had moved far beyond their comfort zone. What had started as a celebrity interview had transformed into something resembling a legal deposition, with accusations flying and positions hardening by the minute. Sarah seemed to be reaching her limit. So essentially, your position is that anyone who doesn't actively support your version of events is complicit in abuse. That's quite a standard to set. The sarcasm in her voice was unmistakable, and it seemed to be the final straw for Meghan. Her voice, when she responded, carried a level of anger that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. My version of events. Meghan's voice cracked with incredulity. My version includes documented racist headlines, recorded death threats, and medical records showing the impact on my mental health. But sure, let's call it my version since apparently lived experience doesn't count as evidence anymore. The studio atmosphere had become toxic. Joy leaned back in her chair, her expression suggesting she had heard enough. Look, we all understand that joining any family can be challenging, but family, Meghan interrupted, her voice rising to a level that made the producers visible scrambling in the control booth. Is that what we're calling it? Because most families don't issue press releases about their members' private conversations. Most families don't coordinate with tabloids to undermine each other. Most families don't stand by while their members receive death threats. Whoopi tried once more to regain control. Meghan, I think we need to. No. Meghan's voice cut through the studio like a blade. She was fully standing now, her careful posture abandoned entirely. I'm tired of being interrupted. I'm tired of being dismissed. I'm tired of being told that my experiences don't matter because they're inconvenient for everyone else's narrative. The panel sat in stunned silence as Meghan continued, her voice shaking with emotion. You want to know why we left? This is why. This exact dismissive attitude. This refusal to engage with the reality of what we experienced. This insistence that somehow we're the problem. Sarah's voice was icy when she responded. Maybe because your solution to every problem seems to be a television interview. First Oprah, then Netflix, now here. At what point do you take responsibility for your role in perpetuating the very media attention you claim to want to escape? The question hit like a physical blow. Meghan's face went through a rapid series of expressions before settling into something approaching fury. Take responsibility? I should take responsibility for racist attacks on my child. I should take responsibility for an institution's failure to evolve. I should take responsibility for protecting my family when no one else would. You should take responsibility for your choices. Joy shot back, her comedian's instincts fully engaged now. The choice to air private family matters publicly. The choice to make serious allegations without concrete proof. The choice to position yourself as a victim of one of the world's most respected institutions. The word victim seemed to detonate something explosive inside Meghan. Her carefully constructed public persona completely shattered as she turned toward Joy with undisguised anger. Victim? You think I'm playing victim? I survived 2 years of systematic racist abuse while pregnant and postpartum. I sought help for suicidal thoughts and was told it would be bad for the institution's image. I watched my husband struggle with the impossible position of choosing between his family and his wife. But sure, I'm just playing victim. The raw pain in her voice was undeniable, but instead of generating sympathy, it seemed to harden the panel's resolve. Alyssa leaned forward with cold precision. If the situation was truly that dire, why not leave immediately? Why stay for 2 years? Why continue royal duties while supposedly being systematically abused? Meghan's response was immediate and passionate. Because we believed it could get better. Because Harry thought his family would eventually step up and protect us. Because leaving meant abandoning everything he'd worked for his entire life. We tried to make it work until it became clear that our physical and mental health were at risk. Physical health. Sarah's eyebrows shot up. Now you're alleging physical threats from the royal family. I'm alleging that death threats against a pregnant woman constitute threats to physical health, especially when the people with the power to stop them choose not to act, Meghan replied, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. The studio had become a battlefield. Joy seemed to be reaching her breaking point as well. So your position is that the British royal family, one of the most scrutinized institutions in the world, actively endangered your life by not responding to anonymous death threats the way you wanted them to? My position, Meghan said, her voice now steady but filled with steel, is that when you have the power to protect someone and you choose not to exercise that power, you bear responsibility for what happens next. When you can end systematic harassment with a single statement, and you choose silence, you become part of the problem. Whoopi made one final attempt to salvage the interview. I think we're all getting a bit heated here. Maybe we should. No, Meghan said firmly, turning toward Whoopi with an intensity that silenced the veteran host. I'm done being managed. I'm done being told to calm down or step back or consider other perspectives. I came here to discuss my work, my philanthropy, my projects. Instead, I'm being subjected to the same interrogation, the same skepticism, the same dismissive attitude that drove us away in the first place. The panel exchanged glances that suggested they had all reached the same conclusion simultaneously. Sarah was the first to voice it. Maybe that's because your story doesn't add up. Maybe that's because your allegations are serious enough to require serious scrutiny. Maybe that's because the rest of us aren't willing to simply accept everything you say at face value. The comment seemed to be the final breaking point. Meghan's face flushed with anger as she stood up fully, her voice rising to a level that made the sound technicians wince. Accept at face value? I've provided documentation, medical records, contemporaneous notes, witness statements. What more do you want? Video footage of every racist attack? Audio recordings of every dismissive conversation? Screenshots of every death threat? We want consistency, Joy replied coolly. We want your story to make sense from one interview to the next. We want explanations that don't require us to believe that everyone else is lying except you. The accusation of inconsistency seemed to be the absolute last straw. Meghan grabbed her purse from beside her chair, her movements sharp and angry. This is exactly what I mean. This is exactly the treatment that made staying impossible. Nothing, I say, will ever be enough for people who have already decided on the problem. Alyssa leaned back in her chair with apparent satisfaction. Maybe because you are the problem. Maybe the common factor in all your difficult relationships isn't everyone else. The comment hit like a knockout punch. Meghan stood frozen for a moment, her face cycling through shock, hurt, and finally settling into cold fury. When she spoke, her voice was steady but filled with unmistakable anger. I came here in good faith to discuss my work and my experiences. Instead, I've been subjected to exactly the kind of hostile interrogation that made our lives impossible. This is why people don't speak up about institutional racism. This is why victims stay silent. Because this is how they get treated when they find the courage to tell their truth. She turned toward the panel one final time, her voice carrying a level of dignity that made her earlier emotion seem calculated by comparison. I won't be staying to endure any more of this. Thank you for proving exactly why we had to leave. With that, Meghan turned and walked toward the studio exit, her heels clicking against the floor with sharp precision. The panel sat in stunned silence as she moved past the cameras, past the crew members, and toward the door. Just before reaching the exit, she paused and turned back toward the cameras, her voice carrying clearly across the silent studio. 4. Anyone watching who has experienced institutional racism, gaslighting, or systematic dismissal of their experiences, you're not alone, and you don't have to accept it. The studio door closed behind her with a decisive click, leaving the panel sitting in absolute silence. The cameras continued rolling, capturing the shocked faces of the hosts as they processed what had just occurred. Whoopi was the first to speak, her voice subdued. Well, that was unprecedented. Joy shook her head slowly. I've been doing this for decades, and I've never seen anything quite like that. Sarah looked directly into the camera, her professional composure already returning. We'll be right back after this break. As the cameras finally cut away, the reality of what had just transpired began to sink in. The interview that was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance had exploded into the most dramatic confrontation in The View's history, with both sides leaving viewers to decide who had crossed the line in a battle that laid bare the fundamental disagreements about truth, accountability, and institutional responsibility that continue to divide public opinion.